I'm joined this afternoon by Scott McCartney, who is the aviation expert at the Wall Street Journey, to talk all things aviation. Scott, hi, good afternoon, good morning to you.
Good to be with you, John.
And thank you for joining us. This is a turnaround interview for me, a seminal moment where rather than having to answer the questions, I get to pose the questions. So really looking forward to this. But Scott, I'm intrigued. It sounds to me the greatest job on earth, an aviation journalist for the Wall Street. How did you get there? You must have killed people and fought to get to that position.
Very much. When I got hired, I got hired to develop a beat in rich families, the private equity, wealthy families of Texas in particular. But I told editors that what I really wanted to do was aviation. And at the time, I was in Dallas. Our aviation beat was in Houston, sort of a legacy of Frank Lorenzo and Texas Air, Continental had been the big story. And it really wasn't anymore. And American and Southwest were becoming much bigger players. And so anyway, over time, we decided to move the beat to Dallas. And there I was, ready to go. And so I've been doing it now for, 25 years.
Wow. And of course, at that time, Dallas was the epicenter of aviation in North America, wasn't it? In many respects, you had American and obviously Southwest there as well. So you right place, right moment, I suppose.
Yeah, it really was, and it was a fascinating time to come into the business. I mean, I had the blessing of really learning the business from Herb Kelleher, from Bob Crandall, from Bob Baker, who ran operations at American, from Gordon Bethune at Continental in Houston. They were incredibly smart. They are incredibly smart. Legends of the business, but also very generous people who took the time to really make sure that I understood the business, willing to let me, go inside their companies to really figure out how airlines work and explain that to people. And they saw the value in that, and it turned into a fantastic education for me.
I'm sure. So, is it a simple business, or is it amazingly complex? From someone, looking outside into it, and you having had that sort of privileged exposure, did it strike you as actually this is really simple and people make it complicated?
I think the business itself is really complicated. There are so many moving parts. There is so much uncertainty. Think about it. Sometimes you do everything outdoors, and what would the quality of an automobile be if General Motors had to make cars outdoors? You're subject to Mother Nature. You're subject to the whims of the economy. Everything that happens in the world somehow affects aviation one way or the other. We certainly see that with pandemic. But on the other hand, airline leadership, I think, is actually quite simple. I think the job of the airline CEO, although it certainly you can dive into the numbers and the legal aspects and the political aspects and all that, but at the end of the day, the airline CEO is the football coach. It's a very labor-intensive business, and the people who are successful at it, quite simply, motivate people. And do a very good job of motivating people. And the CEOs who struggle with that, it seems to me over time, they have all failed. So in that sense, I think running an airline can be a very simple thing.
And the people you mentioned earlier were certainly charismatic, inspirational leaders, and you'd follow them off a cliff in some cases, wouldn't you? It was a grand time for the airline industry.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think they understood. Herb and Gordon especially really understood that if they could get their people motivated and working hard, The airline ran better. The customers were happier. You could charge higher fares. You could do lots of things. But if the employees weren't willing to go the extra mile and really hustle to get the job done, then the airline wasn't going to run well. People weren't going to be happy. It was just a sort of a losing experience.
So 25 years ago, you're sitting in Rob Crandall's office, and it was probably quite difficult to see him through the smog that was being created at that moment in time. And you fast forward to the end of 2019. Would you have ever expected the industry to have gotten so large and so complicated, or has it surprised you in that respect?
I would have to say not really, in terms of size, in terms of how people travel, in terms of how ubiquitous travel is. I think that the demand was always there. The industry has, over that 25 years, the industry has really moved in many ways. We saw the beginning and development of code sharing, the beginning and development of the big major alliances, and ultimately of alliances with antitrust immunity. All of that made it easier for people to travel around the world. We have seen, and not quite sure you saw this coming, but younger generations, I certainly saw it in my own children, younger generations that wanted to travel extensively and had no qualms about, no inhibitions about going to Vietnam for spring break or wherever it might be. What we saw 25 years ago and before was the advent of low-cost transportation, air transportation, and the idea that would spread worldwide, that would make it easier for people to travel. I think all the signs were there. All the signs were there really with the advent of the 747 in the late 60s, and which sort of made it possible for middle-class people to travel, and that trend just continued.
Absolutely, exponentially all around the world. And I mean, one of the things I find quite ironic is that you're a principal journalist for one of the world's most revered financial publications, and yet probably until 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, this was an industry that just enjoyed losing money, didn't it? And filing for Chapter 11s. It was, although it was glamorous, for some reason it never really seemed to cut it for a long time, did it?
No, that's true. I used to joke that if the industry ever figured out how to run their business, I'd be out of a job. But I didn't think that was going to happen in my lifetime. It's certainly gotten better at it, but the challenges have gotten bigger in some ways. But you're right. The industry never made money. Actually, from an investor standpoint, there was no lack of interest. The volatility of the industry made it really important to investors. They weren't going to be long-term holders, but the ups and downs of the airline industry, people made a lot of money off of that, and they certainly cared deeply, and still do today, care deeply about our coverage. Yeah.
If you look at the US market, it certainly has benefited from that period of consolidation when the big six became three, really, didn't they? And secured that critical mass. That from looking from London into the US market, that was the moment when things really did change.
Yeah, I think so. I'm always struck by the similarities. Between the European market and the U.S. market. The U.S. market, as you say, three big players, one big, couple big low-cost carriers, lower-cost carriers. Southwest, we still call a low-cost carrier. We can debate that point, but certainly a low-fare carrier. So you have the three big guys. Then you have Southwest, JetBlue, Spirit. In Europe, you have three big international network carriers and two major low-cost carriers and a collection of others, and it's really sort of very similar. And I think that that provides pretty good competition. Some people in the U.S. still bemoan the consolidation reduced competition. It did in some markets. There's no doubt about that. But it enabled the big network carriers to actually become profitable, which ultimately is a good thing for travelers. They need to get a return on their investment. They need to be able to invest in new airplanes, in refurbishing terminals, all the things that airlines spend money on to provide better service. So that part of it has helped. I think consolidation has really sort of opened up more worldwide travel possibilities. And, we still enjoy very low fares. Even before the current crisis, fares had gone up some, but relatively speaking, air travel was still a bargain. And so there was enough competition in the marketplace amongst the three big carriers themselves, but also with the discipline of low-cost carriers. If you wanted to fly cheap, you certainly could.
And I think it's ironic, the regulator occasionally dips in and has a look around competitive practices and all of these sort of things, and it never really finds any evidence that would suggest that fares are any higher in today's environment, or that airlines are in some way or other charging more than a competitive market normally would. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's fascinating that, on either side of the Atlantic, we have a very similar sort of structure across our airlines and their segments. And it looks like it's going to go that way in Asia as well, doesn't it? I mean, you've got the big three Chinese carriers, and you've got the big three Southeast Asian carriers. It's a model that works.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's not necessarily by design, but I think it's how markets work out. Three big players provides a lot of discipline and a lot of opportunity, but also gives those players the size and the cost efficiencies to really be competitive and offer a good product. And then there's room for others underneath that. And so it really does, I think, provide some stability, both for the airline industry, but also for the traveler.
Mm. And where we do differ, though, is in Europe. Some of our legacy long-haul carriers dallied with the A380. Lufthansa, British Airways, Air France, and of course Emirates' whole fleet is predicated on the A380. But it never attracted a US airline, did it? Why were they not interested in it when everyone else at that time saw it as a great solution?
I think there are a couple of reasons. We don't have the slot restrictions, the hub airport restrictions that exist in Europe. We have it on a very limited basis, but there are no slot restrictions at Los Angeles International, New York Kennedy is about the only one. Anybody can fly to Boston. Anybody can fly to Washington. Anybody can fly to Chicago. So there wasn't sort of that limited availability of landing slots at the major hub airports. And then I think too the U.S. market has always been. I think carriers learned the lesson early. Bob Crandall used to say you could never have an airplane that's too small. Mm-hmm. And if there is a limited number of seats, then you get some pricing power.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's okay to have demand exceed capacity. The nature of the business is if you're planning ahead, if you're taking a vacation, they're going to need to fill seats with cheap fares, but there's also going to be a premium for the last minute fare. And if you have too many seats in a market, that's just not going to work. And I think that was the case with the A380, certainly for U.S. airlines. Now, it may be that, at the time that people were ordering the A380 and all, the U.S. industry was a lot more competitive. And so, Northwest and Delta, neither of them probably had the traffic to fill an A380. Maybe together they did, and that would have been different. But I think by that time, there were attractive alternatives with 2 engines instead of 4 engines. And then the fear that, you can fill that airplane on Friday night, on, Sunday night or whatever, but you're not going to fill it on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday.
No.
And if you do, you're going to do it with a lot of low fares that really upset the pricing structure.
Absolutely. And of course, if you're using that aircraft type and it's essentially international to international connectivity, then ultimately price becomes the only decision-making factor for many people. And there's always someone who's got a cheaper price in the market or is willing to, offer a sharper fare for a particular flow of traffic. So it can be quite difficult to fill it, even in the best of times.
Yeah, no, and obviously we see that in the worst of times now, where the A380 and the 747, they're done. At least it seems at passenger airlines, because there's just not going to be the demand for a considerable length of time where you can fill those airplanes again.
So, Scott, at the end of 2019, reflecting on the last, or 2019, which had been a very good year for the industry, and just thinking about 2020, you probably would have been full of optimism for really positive articles, talk about growth, fleet plans, expansion, investment, all of those sort of things. The industry was in rude health at that moment, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. This had been going on for a while, my focus is very much for the traveler. I write for the consumer. Mm-hmm. But, the consumer was enjoying a lot of benefits, people were enjoying good service. Business class service certainly, had reached quite proficient levels of excellence at a lot of airlines. I was writing a lot about premium economy, which is becoming just a more and more attractive alternative for a lot of travelers. But and the problem, we look back and, problems seem trivial in hindsight, but, people complaining about the occasional lost bag, whether you get hit with baggage fees, all those kinds of things. Yeah. And now at a time when, it's really tens of, billions of dollars of refunds out there that are at stake. Everything else seems quite insignificant.
It does, and I mean, sadly, we're veterans of this industry, but I don't think anyone could have rationally forecast or highlighted a risk of a global pandemic and how savagely it hit the aviation industry. But it was, you could sort of see it like a tsunami going around the globe, couldn't you? It was a fascinating learning experience.
No, it was. It'll be interesting to see how history treats it, if you will. We had some warning shots, H1N1, even Ebola, but different outbreaks that really had a severe impact on aviation. What we knew from that was that the aviation got hit early and got hit hard. And so from that perspective, I mean, there's great debate in the U.S. Could you have foreseen the pandemic or not? And after Ebola, the folks in the White House sat down and wrote a plan. And Bill Gates says, he was saying his biggest fear was a global pandemic. And people, there were warnings, but then again, I don't think anybody really sort of seriously envisioned what has happened and the extent that it's happened. A lot of us in the business, I think, thought, certainly in the U.S., 9/11 was about as bad as it could ever get. Yeah. And this is, 10, 20 times worse than 9/11 in terms of traffic reduction.
And if you sort of visualize a globe, I mean, the Americas and specifically North America had that sort of double whammy hit of the outbound Chinese market heading towards the west coast of the US and indeed even into some East Coast destinations. And also, of course, that flow that was coming across from Europe. So you sort of got it from both sides, didn't you, in a relatively short period of time. But I'd be interested, how did the airlines do all that they could as early as they could?
That's a really interesting question. I tend to think they did in the sense that they seemed to ground airplanes very quickly. A lot of capacity came out quickly. It is one of the unique things about the airline business. When we talked before about how complex it is, one of the advantages is the assets are all movable. So it's more difficult to close a hotel. You can't pick up a hotel and move it to another city or park it in the desert, but you can with an airplane. So there was that. I think the airlines, both in the U.S., certainly in Europe and in Asia some too. They have been very effective at getting government assistance and financing that they needed. And, this was all done fairly quickly. Yeah. In terms of additional loans, mortgaging frequent flyer programs, however it might be. There was the very quick realization that they needed to raise cash and ride out the storm. So we've seen failure of some small airlines. We've seen some restructuring bankruptcies underway, but not at the big, huge carriers. Governments have stepped up, and I think airlines have really been pretty proactive about hunkering down and riding out the storm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, in the United States, you rapidly passed the CARES Act that I think runs until the end of September, which that was billions of dollars of support for the travel and aviation sector, wasn't it?
Right, more than $50 billion, which was a huge shot in the arm, not just for airlines but the employees that are kept on the payroll. And as you say, the obligation to keep employees on the payroll expires at September 30. We may see, tens of thousands of layoffs in the U.S. Airline sector come October 1st. But then again, maybe not. There's a lot of lobbying going on for additional government assistance. And so, it makes sense in some ways. This is not just about protecting airlines. It's about protecting the economy.
Absolutely.
You need air service to have a global economy, to have a vibrant domestic economy. It's not just a major employer, but it's a major function for so many businesses that need to move cargo, that need to move people, that need to be able to go see clients or do deals or whatever it might be. And if you don't have air service, you really have a setback in the economy. And the problem is, if airlines lay off a bunch of skilled people, it takes months to get them back.
Absolutely.
If you can get them back.
Yeah, you've got to retrain them. Got to be recertified. All of those tasks. It goes on forever, doesn't it? But one of the things from the data we've been seeing is, this expectation when COVID-19 started around April, early May. The expectation was, we need this to help us get through to the end of September, and by August, things will begin to pick up. And clearly they haven't. TSA numbers are still languishing in the sort of 28-29% of last year's volumes. And capacity is, on a global basis, below 60 million. And I think we've already come out in OAG and said we may have had the best month or the best week of the pandemic and the new normal 2020. Is there a broad realization in the US market that this could be a really tough winter for everyone?
I think there is for winter. The interesting variation is what happens next year, because there are differing views on that. But yes, I think June. There was optimism in June. The things were starting to pick up, and then we saw outbreaks increase in a lot of states that were trying to open up early in the U.S. And so July numbers dipped, and August came back some because there's so much pent up demand. But I think that goes away as schools reopen, and we've already started to see that. If you have to be home with your kids, you're not going to be traveling, and period. And so there is the traditional end of summer drop off, and typically what the industry relies on then is business travel, but there is no business travel. Period. Zero. Very little. Except for hospital workers and folks like that. Very little business travel going on. And so I think we're going to see a big drop off in the fall. You may see some weeks of the holiday season be okay. That may depend on, can you get to a Caribbean island or Mexico or someplace not too far. I think people will be leery about venturing far afield because they don't want to get stuck. They don't want to have an outbreak, close borders and leave them trapped. And so it's going to be a very tough winter. The question is what happens next year, and I think that depends a lot on vaccine and treatment, and that's what it will take to get people confident that they can travel again.
And that business demand is all important, isn't it? Because it's not just, the volume, it's the fact that generally they're paying maybe 60-70% more than a leisure passenger. The road warrior is out there every week traveling around the US and in Europe and other places, and airlines just can't, and companies just don't want to put their employees at risk at the moment, do they? It's a real conundrum for everyone.
Yeah, it is, and you're right. The business travel is about the dollars. It's not necessarily about the volume. I think rough figures, business travel is about a third of a big airline's business, but as much as 2/3 of its revenue. And so you take that out, and for companies, look, there are duty of care questions about sending somebody out on the road now. What happens if they do contract the virus? Is there liability risk for the company? The company doesn't want to do that. Where are you going to go if offices are closed down and there are no conventions or no trade shows, and nobody wants to see you if you do go to visit a client? They're all doing Zoom calls at their home or whatever the technology would be. So I think there's very little business travel now, but I think that's going to be the case, and this is the real challenge for the industry going forward. Of when does that come back? And does it ever come back to 2019 levels? It's going to be be a slow return, most likely, and may never get, maybe a long time before it gets back to 2019 levels, just in terms of business travel.
And I suspect, that's a major driver to the European airlines' decisions to essentially stop the A380 and 747 operations, because they had huge business class cabins, didn't they, relative to the size of the aircraft and the configuration. And, maybe, just maybe, whether it's deliberately designed or luck, the US carriers with their relatively smaller long-haul business class cabins, but high quality product, are in the right place for the new normal.
Yeah, I think that could well be correct. I think the twin engine planes, the 787, the 777, the A350, those are going to be the workhorses of long haul international travel, and it does give them the flexibility to have a business class cabin, a premium economy cabin, more tailored to a smaller market or smaller demand. I think it'll come back. One of the interesting things about those cabins is whether there actually may be more demand from leisure travelers for that as people look at space on an airplane. And I don't want to sit and coach anymore shoulder to shoulder with somebody who, even if they have a mask on, they might be sick. If I get a business class pod, I'm isolated, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us on to this whole discussion that sort of developed probably May and June as well, which is about the middle seat, inspired, of course, by Delta, either a great marketing ploy or something that's reassured people. How has that played out? Because I see Delta are committing today to extend that out to January, the middle seat being free. Is that really it a sensitive issue in the North American market?
It is, and extending it out to January, that's exactly the point you made earlier about the limited demand of the winter.
Yeah, you don't need to worry about January. There will be no one.
Don't worry about filling those seats.
Yeah.
It's a sensitive issue in that some airlines are doing it and some aren't, and so people are really confused or concerned that some airlines are being safer than others, and that's never a good thing for the industry. There questions of should government step in and require that, since some airlines are sort of not being compliant with the idea of blocking the middle seat. It is a really tough thing. To me, Delta is marketing to people who aren't traveling. Delta is saying we are doing everything we can to protect you. Come back when you're comfortable, but we're the guys who protect you. And American and United are saying, look, we're not going to turn away business. And some of their flights are going to have middle seats filled. They're trying to tell customers ahead of time so they can change to other flights, but that's a tricky business, and schedules are so reduced that there may not be convenient other flights. So it's a hard thing, and it does make people more reluctant to travel now, and that may carry over into the future.
And that confusion observation you made is really at the heart of where we are, isn't there? We, for an industry that is quite sophisticated, and with the help of our government agencies and industry agencies, we've managed to create a very confusing set of messages.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Even the notion of wearing masks. And most airlines have said you had to wear masks. Not all, but most have, and it becomes difficult for the flight attendant to actually enforce that without some kind of government mandate. And we don't have government mandate. in the U.S., that's added to the confusion of people saying, you can't force me to do it. It just gets really tricky. The whole middle seat argument, airlines have tried to say, hey, look, we have these great ventilation systems on airplanes, and the air is filtered by HEPA filters used in hospital operating rooms. And there actually is very little evidence of onboard transmission, and a lot of reasons why the airplane cabin is really potentially pretty safe. On the other hand, you are sitting crammed next to somebody else, and that's the fear. If the person next to you happens to have the virus, no amount of ventilation is going to help, and that's the risk. And so I think the industry, because it has crammed so many seats in, has created this perception among the traveling public that an airplane cabin is a sardine can, and that's no place to be if there's a virus going around. No matter how safe it actually might be scientifically, I think emotionally it's just seen as not safe.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've gone through this whole event, and we're always learning. And yet, I remember right at the beginning someone saying to me, in adversity is opportunity. And looking on the more positive side of what's happened and looking at the rebuild out, where is the opportunity in the US market? Do you think, is it about someone making a brave and bold consolidation play? Is it about someone starting a new airline? Because, there were plans for some people who had previously launched airlines in the US to put a new carrier out there this year.
Sure.
What do you think is going to happen on the consolidation front to begin with? Is there going to be consolidation, or is it a pretty static situation?
I think it's very difficult for one of the big three to do anything in terms of consolidation, especially if there's a change in administration in Washington. Even for American, for example, it's got now deeper partnerships with Alaska and with JetBlue.
Yeah.
And I think that's an acknowledgement that it can't buy either one of those. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't fly as a consolidation fly because of consolidation concerns. I do think there may be room for consolidation among some of the smaller players, and so you might see that happen, especially as this drags on. Would it make sense for a couple of ultra low cost carriers to team up and have more heft and more market share that would help them. But I do think that, as you say, there is going to be this great restart, if you will, and there may be loyalties may have withered, as people aren't as beholden to their frequent flyer programs or their credit card, aviation credit cards, or whatever it might be, and so you could have shifting loyalty. You could have, I think there'd be room for a startup airline. Do you want to start an airline in a pandemic? No, but coming out of a pandemic, when there is a whole lot of pent-up demand, that might be the perfect time to start an airline because, look, you're going to be able to get gates and space in an airport terminal and all of that, because there's been so much shrinking, there's going to be availability.
And it's fascinating. If we go back to 9/11, Ryanair and Michael O'Leary had a fax on Boeing's office almost immediately saying, "I want to buy a load of 737s, please," because he knew the price was going to tank. And in the last 3 months, we've seen Wizz Air in Europe on the most ambitious expansion plan that everyone looks at and says, really, what is the basis of that? And that rapid first mover advantage can sometimes be, from an entrepreneurial perspective, a brilliant strategic move.
No, I think that's right. And the aircraft value and the aircraft availability, those are huge factors. And so if you're a Wizz Air, if you're a startup, if you're whatever, and you run the numbers, and all of a sudden it costs you 30-40% less to lease an A320 or a 737. All of a sudden, if there are used aircraft available that other carriers have shed that are really pretty decent aircraft still, 15 years of life on them or whatever, that's an opportunity. If you're gonna, if you want to go to new aircraft, my gosh, Boeing and Airbus both have a whole lot of manufacturing capacity but a whole lot of aircraft sitting on the ground that have already been built that may need homes, and so I think there is a whole lot of opportunity to do something with a big splash.
So does that make, notwithstanding where we are, and for all of our sakes, this has got to finish sooner rather than later. Are you broadly optimistic about the aviation industry? We've survived 9/11, we've bounced back, pandemics, global financial crises. Many of those recoveries were built on the foundation of business traffic, and that clearly doesn't look like it's going to come back as quickly. But where's your optimism meter at the moment? Is it optimistic, or is it still a bit concerned?
Oh, I think very much still a bit concerned. I think what we don't know is how long can airlines last in this environment. We know it's not forever. I think as you alluded to before, I think everybody was planning. Okay, let's have enough cash on hand to make it a year. But what if there are so many unknowns? What if a vaccine is not effective, or what if not widely used? What if the treatment doesn't, effective treatment doesn't materialize? And so there's just a lot of changes in travel. That's going to result in a much smaller industry going forward. Now the hope is that we'll bounce back and people will have confidence in travel sometime next year, certainly by the end of next year. But I think people are hoping, next summer could be a great travel season for airlines. Everybody's going to want to go, but that would be wonderful. But I still think there are so many unknowns that, if that doesn't materialize, there's going to be a lot of concern for the viability of a whole lot of airlines that don't have the money to survive without business going into next summer. And
I guess, Scott, for you, and indeed for me and for OAG and the data, the good bit of that is, if it's a successful recovery, there's absolutely lots to write about, and it's really exciting. Mm-hmm. And if it's not as going to be successful as perhaps we want it to be, there will still be lots of stories to write and plays that will occur. So the only benefactors perhaps in this are us who continue to write about it. What would be, in closing, your takeaway from what you've seen? What is your abiding memory of the last 7 months and the aviation industry? Was it an iconic picture? Was it a statement from one of the airline CEOs, or just something you saw and has resonated with you ever since?
I would say a picture. There's a picture of, I believe it's in Pittsburgh, where a runway was taken and turned into a parking lot for American Airlines jets, and they are so tip to tip, nose to tail, just sort of mind-boggling, the number of airplanes parked on that straight piece of asphalt. That just sums up everything. The notion that so much was grounded so quickly is what this pandemic has been all about.
And you could replicate that probably in 100 airports around the world, couldn't you? It's staggering.
Yeah.
Staggering.
Yeah.
Scott, it's been fascinating. We could chat for hours, and maybe we could do it over a beer at some point rather than over a Zoom call. But I really appreciate your time. It's fascinating, and thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. And I wish you well for the future.
Oh, thank you, John, and really enjoyed it. Really great to talk to you.